We're going to have a bit of a shift here and talk about a part of the geologic record that, unlike earthquake processes, is very well exposed and easily observed at the surface, but that is a product of processes that are sufficiently gradual that they're very difficult to observe directly. And how you can connect that part of the record that you can observe at the surface to some of the major factors that we expect should shape Earth's surface, especially lithology, climate, and even biotic processes. And this is work that I've been helped in by two students, Laura Gibson and Mathieu Botra, and Ken Ferry, postdoc. And the particular pattern that I'm going to focus on today is one of the most widespread emergent features of landscapes, at least on the continents. And that is this characteristic tributary networks that river networks form over time. And I'd like to know what you can observe about this pattern that can tell you about differences in lithology, differences in the biotic processes that are influencing landscapes, and also climatic effects. So we can observe this very well. We have great topographic data sets that are being generated now. What can you glean from these about long-term processes? And how do these amazing patterns emerge? And needless to say, I'm not the first to think about this problem. It has quite a long history. And some of the first people to think about this in the middle part of the 20th century were Robert Horton and Dr. Strahler. And Horton came up with a means of describing the topology of drainage networks and was trying to identify some characteristic structure, some sort of pattern that was diagnostic of erosion processes, as opposed to other dynamics that might be shaping different types of networks that appear in nature. And so he devised this ordering scheme that some of you are probably familiar with over here on the left, where you start with the smallest channels in the landscape, and you call those first order, and when they join, you call that second order, and so on, up the line, to describe hierarchy. And this has become this was early enough that it's become the standard way of describing network topology in some other fields too. I have a friend who's a cardiologist who says, oh yeah, they use this in circulatory systems as well to describe capillary networks. And what Horton proposed is that there are some geometric scaling laws that describe rates of increase or decrease of the numbers of segments of different orders as you go up in order, or the lengths of those segments, or an addition later on from tree was that basin area might scale that one as well. Now this looked good for a while, and it was kind of the gold standard of comparisons. Your model had to be able to explain Horton's laws. But it became clear over the years, starting in the early 60s, up through some papers in the mid-90s, that this scheme and these scaling laws suffer from a lack of uniqueness. That is that not only do all random networks satisfy Horton's laws, but all tributary networks in general satisfy Horton's laws. So it's not telling us something unique about erosion processes. And this steered the course of studies of drainage networks in subsequent years to some extent, in that statistical approach became more popular. And there was a focus on optimality arguments as well. And so one interesting empirical argument about river networks is that they tend to satisfy principles of minimizing local or global energy expenditure of water as it's traveling in channels down through drainage networks. And so you can do things like Alan Howard or Rodriguez, Kirby, and Ronaldo have done here, and start with a random network and then adjust the junctions of the angles at where tributaries meet to minimize the local exposure and expenditure of energy, and come up with patterns that look remarkably like natural networks. So an interesting empirical observation. What this doesn't tell you, though, is what the mechanical processes are that generate these networks. It's a static statistical description, so it doesn't tell you about how the networks evolve over time, and therefore doesn't let you make hindcasts or forecasts about how landscapes evolve in response to changes in these major factors I mentioned at the beginning. So we'd like to do something that maybe can explain where these principles come from, but that also explains how tributary networks arise based on the mechanics of erosion and sediment transport. And I can tell you that the models we create of landscape evolution do generate tributary networks that emerge. And I'll tell you what goes into these types of models in a minute. As of right now, the computer knows why this happens. I'd like to try to understand it myself. There's not a good explanation for how this emerges. And also, the failure of Horton's laws to give us a unique characteristic of drainage networks also makes us ask the question, what can we measure about a landscape like this that allows us to test whether simplified models are giving us an answer that just looks good and passes the sniff test, or whether it actually is telling us something about real landscapes. So I have a suggestion of something we might be able to measure. And to illustrate that, I'll get out of the computer for a second and give you a quick tour of two landscapes that look pretty similar in terms of the processes that are shaping them, but that have one important difference between them. And I'll start with Gavilan Mesa in the Salinas Valley in California. This is about halfway between San Francisco and Los Angeles. And it's a sequence of Pliocene and lower Pleistocene, shallow marine, grading up to subaerial fluvial sediments, pretty weakly lithified. And it's been dissected as this has been uplifted, riding on a block of Salinan granite, and as the Salinas River adjacent has maintained from nearly constant elevation. And it's been dissected into this wonderful drainage network that we surveyed with laser altimetry for the resolution of about 1 meter per pixel. And here's an outcrop of the Paso Robles Formation. This is in the upper part where there are fluvial sandstones and conglomerates. You can break it apart with your hands. And the landscape here, which looks different as you can see during the rainy season in the winter, is shaped by a couple of dominant erosion mechanisms. The valleys are generated by episodic incision of gullies into material that's been transported off the hill slopes and stored there. Just cuts through that and sizes down into the bedrock. Not all of the valleys here are channeled. This seems to happen once every few decades or so, at least right now. Might have been more common in the Pleistocene. And the sediment transport on hill slopes is dominated by biogenic effects, especially burrowing by mammals. In this case, there are some burrows that are larger. These are fox. The smaller ones here are ground squirrels, which you can hardly avoid stepping on as you walk around the landscape. And it might seem surprising at first that this could do enough, this could move enough mass to actually shape the topography over geologic time. But some of the displacements can be pretty substantial. This was not generated by the shovel, it's just there for scale. So this is a burrow spoil that has experienced net downslope displacement. Right? And this ratcheting, this biogenic ratcheting over time, moves mass down the topographic gradient. Okay, so those are the two main processes shaping both of these landscapes. That's Gavilan Mesa. Now on to the second. This is in southwestern Pennsylvania and northern West Virginia, the Allegheny Plateau. You can see a Google here and in a LiDAR map collected by the state of Pennsylvania, which has been virtually deforested, filtered out all of the vegetation, so you can see the underlying topography. This also is very intricately dissected landscape. You don't notice this at first flying over the eastern U.S. and the Appalachians, but once you get rid of the vegetation, it's very striking topography. Now here we have a similar set of processes operating. The geology is different. Still sedimentary rocks, and I apologize to all of the structural geologists and the petrologists here. These are pretty boring from that standpoint. And I've chosen the landscapes to be structurally boring intentionally so that the drainage network is not controlled by rock structure. So these are horizontally bedded Permian, Pennsylvania sedimentary rocks, much better lithified than at Gavilan Mesa, needless to say. So you have the usual assemblage of carbonates, shales, of course. This is right over the Marcellus Shale. Siltstones, coal. And at the surface, things look qualitatively similar, right? Soil mantled, vegetated landscape, these broadly concave down, smooth hill slopes, episodic gully incision in the valleys. But here's the one thing that's different about the two landscapes. It's kind of like stepping into Gulliver's Travels, because everything in Pennsylvania is 4 times bigger. And so if I map the drainage network in both of these places, and I measure the areas drained by the first order valleys in the landscape in using Horton's scheme, and then the second order valleys in the landscape, the smallest ones that have tributaries. And I show you the frequency distributions of both of those. Over a few thousand of them in each case. They're log normally distributed. They have a characteristic mode, and then there's a separation between the modes. Right? But you can see from that separation that the smallest valleys that have tributaries in the Allegheny Plateau are about 4 times as big as the ones in Yellow Mesa. Right? So this is something that we can extract from a map of the drainage network that should be a characteristic signature of the erosion processes shaping the landscape. And the question I want to pose to you is, what controls this characteristic scale that emerges in branching networks? At the finest scales of the tributary networks, what controls when valleys start to branch? So to answer that question, let's start by stepping back a little bit and ask why drainage basins form in the first place. And you can understand them as an instability that occurs in landscapes that are subject to erosion by channel line flow. So if you imagine starting with a planar surface and perturbing that surface, and you have flow traveling either through the shallow subsurface or even as overland flow and forming channels. When you perturb the surface, it's going to focus flow towards that perturbation. And if the rate of erosion goes as the water flux past a given point, that means you're going to erode faster in the perturbation. And that's going to enlarge it further and get a positive feedback when you size the landscape. Okay, so that's the instability. And usually we describe channel incision as going as the rate of incision going as shear stress exerted by the flow on the bed of the channel, or more broadly, it's just the rate of energy expended, so-called stream time, as the water flows. And there's empirical evidence from the field and from some lab experiments that this is a reasonable description. So this amplifies the perturbations and forms valleys. But there must be something else that damps them, right? Because you don't see the landscape infinitely finely dissected. Drainage networks kind of look fractal. There are limits. And the limit is the biogenic transport that I mentioned a minute ago, at least in these landscapes, which, if they drive a flux that's proportional to the topographic gradient, mimics a diffusive effect. Now, it's not molecular diffusion that John was talking about. This is a bulk parameterization of a process that actually consists of a lot of discrete biogenic events that's stirring the soil mantle. But it does have a smoothing effect that we generally describe with either a linear or a nonlinear diffusive. Right? And this effect has been known to be accelerated by burrowing graduate students on occasion. So you have to be careful when you're measuring things in the field. Never trust the short-term rates. All right, so how do we put these together into some kind of a model that generates tributary networks that we can then analyze? This is about the simplest landscape evolution model you can put together that will give you the kind of topographic forms that I've showed you in the line items. So we have soil creep driven by bioactivation, flux linearly proportional to the topographic gradient. That's what generates a diffusive term. Channel incision with a rate that goes as shear stress or energy expenditure. Regardless of which of these you use, you end up with a term that has a gradient in it. Right? So if you cover this up, it actually looks like a kinematic wave term. But there's one important difference, and that is that there is a drainage area here as well. This is a proxy for the flux of water that's traveling through the channel at a given point. And that's important because drainage area varies by orders of magnitude over the landscape, from up near the ridgeline, where you have hardly any, to down in a very convergent area where you have lots. And it's a function of the topography. So there's this nonlinear feedback that operates as the landscape evolves, where this term can vary dramatically in space and time. So that makes it a nonlinear kinematic. And you put that together with a source term, which is either uplift of bedrock relative to some fixed datum, or equivalently, depending on your reference frame, lowering of a boundary, like a larger channel in sizing relative to the rest of the landscape. Put those three things together, and that gives you the rate of change of elevation with time at any given point in the landscape. All right, so that's generally what a simple landscape evolution model looks like. You have a term that dampens perturbations, channel incision term that amplifies them and makes valleys grow, and then you have the source term that's creating topographic slopes. So how do you describe, or how do you analyze a system like this as a first cut? And the way I like to do it is to start with dimensional analysis. And the way you would approach this if it were an analogous linear advection diffusion system, like heat transfer in a rather poorly sketched magma chamber over here, is you might try to attach a characteristic time scale to conductive heat losses and heat losses due to transport and flow, and the ratio of the diffusive to advective timescales as a definition of a Pickley. So this characterizes the relative strength of those two terms. You can do the same thing for landscapes and generate a topographic Pickley. And the approach is the same, a diffusive timescale, an advective timescale, where the relevant velocity here is actually the speed at which signals in the topography will propagate up through the channel network. So it's not actually the flow of the water, it's much slower. And then there's a length scale in here, right? There's a length scale in the Pickley. And so what does this mean? A Pickley number less than 1 means that you are at a diffusively dominated scale, up near the tops of the ridgelines. Or equivalently, you can say that you're just diffusively dominated because that term is really strong. So there's an interchange between the relative magnitude of diffusion versus channel incision and spatial scale. If the Pickley number is very large, that means you're completely dominated by channel incision. You get very high order range networks. So that's the framework I'm going to use to try to understand where tributary networks come from. So when we solve this forward in time, you can see that the Pickley number gives us a description of both the density of dissection of the drainage network, and it also tells us how dynamic the drainage network is over time. So you can see at smaller Pickley numbers, there's more of a dynamic adjustment between the positions of the ridge lines and the drainage network. Whereas at the very largest scales, the drainage network is influenced more by initial conditions and sizes into the landscape and then becomes kind of static. There's some adjustment that goes on near the divides, but this is the scale that I'm going to be focusing on for the rest of the time. So let's play another game here and just start with some first order drainage basins in red here and just keep turning up the knob on the Pickley number over time. And you're going to see a transition here where eventually some of the basins widen at the expense of their neighbors as they compete for drainage area. Once they do that, they develop tributaries, and then they become second-order drainage basins. So there are these two processes that occur. One, they have to outcompete their neighbors for drainage area, right? So there's kind of a Darwinian flavor in all of this. And then they have to grow tributaries. And I'm going to show you two instabilities now that help us predict when those two things happen, to give us an explanation for when you transition from first order to second order drainage basins. So if I run lots of simulations, not like the one you just saw, but keeping the parameters constant the whole time, but varying the Pickley number, starting from a low relief random initial condition, running to a fixed equilibrium. And then I measure the sizes of all of the drainage basins in the landscape. And I plot a normalized measure of the size of the drainage basins. When I say size, I mean drainage area, against the Pickley number. You see a shift at a Pickley number somewhere around between 200 and 300, 250. Where for values lower than that, this configuration of parallel first order drainage basins is stable. And by stable, I mean that if you perturb one of the basins away from that equilibrium by, say, enlarging its drainage area, it'll restore back. So, for example, if you perturb this one by enlarging its drainage area a little bit, it starts by trying to displace the ridge lines on either side and steal drainage area from its neighbors, but they push back. And this configuration remains stable. But now I'll show you a displacement away from this unstable equilibrium, where instead all of the drainage basins go to one of these two stable states. You either enlarge at the expense of your neighbors and form tributaries, become a second order basin, or you shrink down. So this one has had its drainage area enlarged slightly, and that perturbation grows unstably and propagates through the whole landscape until all of the basins are either first or second order. And they have this bimodal distribution of size. So that tells us at least why this widening at the expense of the neighboring basin starts. It doesn't really explain why the tributaries form. So there's a second instability that governs that. And that is, we can try to understand that by doing an even simpler experiment where we start by taking a planar slope that's vertically exaggerated and perturbing it with a very low amplitude sinusoid of varying wavelengths, and doing this for a range of different Peclet numbers and measuring whether the perturbation grows or decays. Right? So I'm doing this numerically. You could try to tackle it analytically too, but the drainage area feedback is a little bit difficult to linearize. So I've just chosen to do it numerically. And you can see that at Peclet numbers less than about 50 or 60, perturbations of all wavelengths will decay when you keep a flat planar slope. But once you get to a Peclet number of 60 or so, there's at least a small range of wavelengths that will grow unstable. And that means that you will form, if this is the side slope of one of these basins that started to widen, you'll form tributaries in these side slopes. Right? So to show this a little more visually, the first order parallel drainage basins have a side slope length, and because the Peclet number depends on spatial scale, it will put you down here. Once the basins widen, there's room on the side slopes for at least some wavelengths to grow unstable. So the combination of these two instabilities makes a prediction. We can now go back and test in the landscape by making measurements of the topography and ultimately of erosion rates. And that is that the transition to second order drainage basins, the smallest ones that start to branch and form tributaries, should occur at this critical Peclet number of between 200 and 300, independent of the absolute spatial scale of the landscape. So even though things are 4 times as big in the Allegheny Plateau, the critical Peclet number should be about the same. So how do we go about measuring the Peclet number, which depends on long-term process rates that are hard to measure directly in these two sites? And the approach I've chosen to try to get around the difficulty of extrapolating very short-term noisy process measurements to several million years is to use the form of the topography that has emerged, and taking advantage of the fact that the two terms in our governing equation that are driving the landscape evolution vary in their magnitude over the landscape. So for example, if you want to cross out the channel incision term, you analyze a part of the landscape where drainage area and the topographic slope are really small. And that's up a drainage device, like this green shaded area here, where you approach a constant Laplacian of elevation. So the hill slope is concave down with about the same curvature in the ridge lines. When you do that, you can solve for the diffusivity, the soil creep diffusivity, as a function of the driving uplift or boundary lowering rate, and then the curvature of the hill size. Once you have that term, you can go back and plug it in to the rest of the governing equation, do a regression over lots of different channel profiles, and solve for the ratio of the stream incision coefficient to the diffusivity. It doesn't give you their absolute magnitudes, but it gives you the ratio. And that's what you need in the Peclet number. There's also this exponent on drainage area, which is generally about a half. And this tells you how channel width and channel discharge change with increasing drainage area. Right, so that's close to a half usually. Right, so this gives us the values we need to plug in to calculate the Peclet number for each of those drainage basins that I plotted in the histograms at the beginning. So we can go back to this, those distributions now, and instead of plotting against absolute spatial scale, we'll plot against the Peclet number. So each of these drainage basins, since you know its drainage area, you have that ratio of rate coefficients, you can calculate its Peclet number and compare it with the critical values that we inferred that are associated with each of these instabilities. and make a comparison. So the first thing you note is that the transition, the gap between the modes here, first and second order drainage basins, falls pretty close to that critical value of about 250 that I inferred from this stability factor here. Works a little bit better in Pennsylvania than it does in California, but you're generally not off by more than a factor of 2. The second thing to compare it to is the critical value at which you start to form first order drainage basins. And you can see that these distributions truncate at a value that's pretty close to that. Right? So that tells you about where the channel network starts. And the second one tells you where tributary junctions begin. Now, what can we take away from this? You can start to compare this ratio of rate coefficients, which is really difficult to measure directly, just by looking at the patterns in the topography. And in particular, if you know what the critical Heckley number is at which the tributary junctions first begin, and you can measure the drainage areas of drainage basins of first and second order, that means you can infer something about this ratio of rate coefficients and make a comparison between a landscape that gets about 1 meter of rain a year versus one that gets a few tens of centimeters of rain a year. One where infiltration is faster, you have a more permeable soil, which is one where you get more overland flow, and one where the rock strength varies with the liquefaction pretty substantially. But we can do a little bit better than this, even. It would be nice to know what the individual values of those rate coefficients are, so we can relate them individually to biotic and climatic processes and lithologic characteristics. And in particular, you want to know which is really driving the difference in spatial scales. Is it the bioturbation effects? Is it differences in the diffusivity of landscapes in different locations? And channel incision is the same everywhere? Or is it a difference in the efficiency of channel incision? So the way we've done that is to go back to this expression that relates the hill slope diffusivity to the curvature and the erosion rate over the landscape, which we can measure with cosmogenic nuclides, in this case cosmogenic beryllium-10, in stream sediments to give us an average long-term erosion rate over a few thousand years over a drainage basin. And when you do that and measure the hill slope curvature, you can get the diffusivity. Once you have the diffusivity, we know this ratio, we multiply them to get back out the stream incision coefficient. So we can do that in Gavilan Mesa, where we get a little over 1/10 of a millimeter per year. And in the Allegheny Plateau, where we have to be a little bit more careful because we know there's a spatial gradient in erosion rates, or at least we guess there should be. This is the Ohio River over here, which reversed its direction about 1 million years ago due to a glacially dammed lake. And due to that increase in drainage area, where it suddenly became the main stem river instead of the tributary, it started to incised vertically more rapidly. And so you can actually see this progressive slowing of erosion rates as you get further away from this pulse of incision that you can see propagating up through the drainage channel. Once you get up into the upper part of the plateau, it doesn't know that's happening yet. So the erosion rates up here are all about 0.03 millimeters per year. Okay, so now we can go back and compare the individual rate coefficients from these two landscapes. And the main thing to point out is that the hill slope diffusivity varies by less than a factor of 2. And these are pretty comparable to rates that have been measured for these coefficients in other temperate landscapes previously. The thing that's really different is the efficiency of stream incision, which differs by about an order of magnitude between them. So the real difference, the reason for this factor of 4 difference in spatial scale is that it's a lot easier to cut into the more buttery rocks at Gavilan Mesa, which are more poorly lithified, and probably also because the infiltration rates here are slower and it's easier to generate overland flow. So you generate more channel discharge for a given amount of rainfall rather than draining it from the subsurface. So to wrap up, I'll give you a set of specific conclusions and then a broader statement. And the specific one relates to the formation of this pattern of drainage networks at fine scales, where basins start to form tributaries by first widening at the expense of their neighbors once they reach a critical ratio of strength of stream incision to the strength of hill slope transport. And then once they widen, their side slopes become long enough that first-order drainage basins can grow as instabilities. And each one of these occurs at a critical value of a landscape picking. And then more broadly, since it's so difficult to measure the rates of these processes over relevant timescales, they happen slowly or episodically. Modern rates might differ from those in the past when climate was different. Another approach you can use is to measure the patterns that emerge in the topography over hundreds of thousands to millions of years and try to relate those to the long-term average rates of these dominant processes. And now that we have higher resolution topographic data from laser altimetry and other sources, and can make long-term measurements of erosion rates, it becomes feasible to start to use the topography to get long-term process efficiencies and relate those to lithology and climate and biology too. So I'll stop there. Thanks.